First of all, I want to thank Christine very much for inviting me to this fantastic event. And I think what's fantastic about it is that it's really a conversation about nuclear power rather than a presentation from all of us. So I think that conversation and having the opportunity to contribute to that conversation is really fascinating for me. And so what I'm going to try and do is give you a little bit of information about what's going on in the rest of the world in my 10 minutes to try and provide a little bit of context to help you frame the conversation that you want to have over the rest of the afternoon. And so when I thought to myself, where should we start? What's a better place to start than to say, what is the role of nuclear power in the world today? Where does it stand and where is it going? So let's talk a little bit about that, because a lot of people don't know. Many people ask me, they say, you've been in this industry for a long time. Why are you still in this industry? Isn't it dead? Didn't it die like 5 years ago or 10 years ago? What's going on? And I think the bottom line is that today there's over 400 nuclear plants in almost 30 countries around the world, for a total installed capacity of 375 gigawatts. So the numbers are pretty big. You can see from the graph that at 14% of global electricity supply, nuclear provides almost the same amount of electricity as hydro does. And that in many of the countries that have nuclear power, similar to Hong Kong, nuclear power provides 20% or more of the electricity generation for those countries. What's also interesting is that China and India today only use about 2% of their electricity from nuclear power, and that's why you'll see this great rush for the next generation of building to be in China and to some extent in India. And the other element about nuclear that's important is that it avoids annual CO2 emissions of about 2.9 billion tons compared to if that same generation was coming from coal-fired generation. Or to put it another way, the amount of savings is equivalent to almost a quarter of the CO2 emissions that's produced by the entire electricity generation sector globally right now. So that gives you a little bit of a sense. This slide just shows you some of the things I want to touch on, to talk about, to give you that context, a little bit about the environment, a little bit about economics, a little bit about fuel availability. These are the issues that people bring up again and again, as well as a number of other issues. But we only have so much time, and so hopefully that will get there in our discussion. Now, seeing where nuclear is today at 14%, where is it going? And if you look around the world, as of today, there are 60 nuclear plants under construction around the world. 164 are planned, and 365 are in the proposed stage. All this information comes from the World Nuclear Association website, and that's a great wealth of information, so I recommend you have a look at it. There's a number of agencies that have projections out 20 years to see where nuclear is going. This nice graphic shows you the WNA reference scenario saying that nuclear will grow from its current 375 gigawatts to about 600 gigawatts in the next 20 years. There's a number of upper scenarios that go as high as 800 gigawatts. And so you can see that, people are looking at nuclear expanding potentially to almost double what it is today in the world over the next 20 years. Now, what's of real interest here is that half of these units under construction are actually in China and India. So there's been a tremendous move in the nuclear industry from west to east, with really most of what's going on in nuclear is happening in China, and that's why Professor Lin's presentation is so important to give you the information that you need. But at the same time, the International Atomic Energy Agency reports that there's 65 new countries that are starting to think about nuclear power, and that maybe as many as 20 or 25 of them will consider implementing their first station by 2030. Now, if we want to look at some of these issues quickly, and we want to talk about environment, one of the key drivers that's brought nuclear back to the agenda globally is because it represents a low carbon source of electricity supply that's both stable and is available for baseload generation. Now, this graphic comes from a report produced by the International Energy Agency earlier this year called the Nuclear Roadmap. And what this does is it looks at a sort of what they call a blue map, which is really a bit of a blue sky scenario. And they've tried to say, well, if we want to reduce CO2 emissions by 50% from 2005 levels, that's 75% is incorrect, by the way, 50% from 2005 levels by 2050, what kind of scenario can we imagine? And what the IEA came up with was a scenario where they would dramatically increase the amount of nuclear in the world from today's 14% to about 24%. And they even have a higher scenario where they would see nuclear going as high as 38%. And what's interesting is that in that scenario, the global cost of electricity actually comes down because of the economic competitiveness of nuclear. So this, this is larger than what sort of most people are sort of projecting in the normal course of events. And what's fascinating about this is as recently as 6 or 7 years ago, if you went to the IEA, which is really one of the main global agencies that predict or forecast electricity use for the future, nuclear wasn't even on their radar. And now they've come to the point where they've put out a special report to say that maybe nuclear is an important contributor to achieving a low carbon economy in the future. And that's a massive change. And it's important to understand that the agency is not really a forecasting agency. They really reflect the policies of the governments of the member countries. So it's telling you that things are changing. Very often people ask about economics, and that's really my specific area. I teach nuclear economics, and this graph comes from an OECD report that came out this March, which is not about nuclear power. This OECD report is called Projected Costs of Electricity. It deals with all the OECD nations and a number of non-OECD nations, and it comes out every 5 to 7 years. This is, I think, the 8th in the series over the past 20 years, to look at relative costs of various forms of electricity. And what you can see from this graphic is that in all regions of the world, nuclear power is competitive. And at this case, it's using a discount rate of 10%. So you can see in Europe, nuclear power is sort of in the middle of the pack. They also have a scenario at a 5% discount rate. And of course, because nuclear is capital intensive at a lower discount rate, it looks even better. And in that case, nuclear is the lowest cost alternative in every region. So it's not really a surprise. You shouldn't be surprised, because if you think about what the options are for generating electricity today, all of these options must be within a reasonable amount of difference in the cost from one to the other. Otherwise, they wouldn't be in consideration. I mean, what we do when we make choices is we choose between this and this and this and this. And one thing in some countries maybe 10% less, somewhere else 10% more. But if something is way out of line, it's probably not on the list. Very often we get asked the question, how about fuel? Is there enough uranium to fuel this nuclear renaissance? And to make the answer short, the answer is absolutely yes. Again, another international document was released this year. It's called the Red Book. It comes out by the Nuclear Energy Agency in the OECD in Paris. And basically their conclusion was, with the current uranium resource, there's enough uranium in the world to power the existing fleet for 100 years. Now, of course, as we build new plants, that gets shorter, but that's looking at low-cost, reasonably available resources. If you look at sort of conventional resources, it goes up. This table shows you a lot of information. And the bottom line is very important, because in our current technology, we only use less than 1% of the energy of the fuel. And so with future technological enhancements and advanced fuel cycles, that 100 years can be leveraged into basically thousands of years of fuel supply. So fuel supply is not an issue. Now finally, before we finish, I just wanted to touch a bit about safety. And safety is a huge topic. I mean, you can have an entire week seminar on safety, but the important things on safety really to remember is that in the nuclear industry, I'm very proud to say that safety is number one. We all look at safety first. And we've learned over the years, we've been the most scrutinized industry, we're the most highly regulated industry, and I think in the end we're all better for it. Because when you look at some of the events that have happened in the world this year, things like the oil spill in the Gulf, or things like miners trapped in a mine in Chile, what we can see is that this diligence in the nuclear industry has really paid off. This graphic, which you can look at your leisure, comes from a recent study by the Nuclear Energy Agency comparing the relative safety of various technologies. And I learned something from this study that I didn't know. And what it says is that more than 2,500 people a year are killed in energy sector related accidents. And that's something I wasn't aware of. But the reality is that in the nuclear industry, that number is 0. So nuclear plants today are really one of the safest forms of electricity generation. And I know people will have different views on it, and I'm sure my colleague here will have a different view. But it's important to have some of the context. And just to give you a little bit of a quote from Stuart Brand's book, and Stuart Brand is an environmentalist from the west coast of the United States. He says, radiation from nuclear energy has killed not a single American, but of all these energy byproducts, and he refers to all the other energy sources, it's the only one we dread. And it's interesting because a lot of what the issues that are related to nuclear industry come from fear. And it's important to discuss it and understand it and see where people are thinking. So finally, to bring my 10 minutes to a close, I hope I stuck to it. Global energy demand is continuing to grow, with electricity being required to fuel economic growth. I mean, there's still 2 billion people in the world with actually 0 access to electricity. And they require electricity to improve their standard of living. Nuclear is a proven technology and is a least cost option for a low carbon strategy. And I'm not suggesting that we should only use nuclear. I think we need to have a mix that includes all of the alternatives, because the world is energy hungry. And we need to open our minds and make use of every low carbon option available to us moving forward. Nuclear expansion is underway, and it's led by the growing economies of China and India, as you already heard. And in a blue sky scenario, nuclear could reach as much as 24% of global capacity by 2050 to help meet global climate goals. And so to finish with one more quote coming from the same book, although it's not really attributed, it says, with climate change, those who know the most are the most frightened. With nuclear power, those who know the most are the least frightened. And so what I'm hoping, in conclusion, what we get from today is that by the end of the day, we all know a little bit more. Thank you.